Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of Syosset Public Library. I'm your host today, Jen, and I am here with an old, let's say Twitter friend, old interviewee friend. Way back in the day, you interviewed me and my co-writer, Sophie, about some webcomics we did. And here we are today talking about your book. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me, Jen. And yes, I was a big fan of Darwin Carmichael is Going to Hell and the subsequent things you guys have done since then. So yeah, it's great to talk to you. So yeah, I'm Brady Dale, and I am the writer of the new book about SBF, Sam Bankman-Fried. So the title is SBF: How the FTX Unwinding Brought Down Crypto's Very Bad Good Guy. I think I got that right. And yeah, I am a longtime crypto reporter. I was following Sam's story way before it went south, and also all the things that enabled Sam's story to happen. And then Wiley asked me if I could put that together into a book really fast, and so I did, and so here we are.
Wow. Yeah. And it is very fast. Like that is actually my first question is, what is it like to write a book about something that is not only so recent, but is still currently evolving? And in addition to that is like so divisive in people's opinions on it and so charged, like, is it,
Yeah.
what was editing something like that like, because do you have to incorporate like up to the moment, breaking stuff or?
Well, I made a decision for the book to deal with that problem, which I don't know, people can love or hate, but I think it made sense for the book. So like the choice I made, we finished the book up. We like it sort of not quite the final, but basically the final version was turned in at the end of 2022. And I decided that like that was the time frame of the book. So like things have happened since then, which like maybe readers would certainly be interested to know. There's been new developments and things like that, but I make the whole book very clear that like this is a story that ends with him getting out of jail in the Bahamas and going home to his parents. Like that's where it stops. And so so that saved us from trying to add updates later. And there are certainly important things that have happened since then, but I still think that's a pretty good place to stop. And like an argument that I make in the book, and I don't know if this comes across, this could be so esoteric that people can't even like, what the heck are you talking about? But one of the things I've really learned as a journalist is that like you see things one way at one time, and then you learn more things, and you don't see it that way anymore. And in fact, it's as if you never saw it that way. And so what I'm trying to do is just sort of preserve, like, amber, like a trapped bug in amber, that moment in time and sort of how we saw it then as best I can. And maybe that's kind of useful as a historical thing for an event that I think people will talk about, I think, for a long time. So yeah, that's sort of how I dealt with that time problem. In terms of like the rest of it, doing the book fast and dealing with all of that. Yeah, I mean, it was really, it was fun to do. It would be hard, I think, for me to do for something that, I mean, it's not like it was easy, but it was easier than I thought it would be. I mean, really, well, so two things I can say, but one is, it's just, this whole world, having been a beat crypto reporter since 2017, this whole world is just one that I know really well. And Sam kind of largely existed in the chunk of it that I know best, which is kind of like the DeFi adjacent world. And so it was just so easy for me to like know what the story was. And obviously I had to go back, I have a lot of sources in the book, but most of those sources are just me remembering what I already knew happened and then plugging in sources that sort of verify things I already knew, but just so you can be like, look, here's things that sort of square with what I'm saying happened. But most of it was straight out of my head because it's just a thing that I knew really well. having been a beat reporter, I don't think I could do something that quickly if you asked me to take on a whole news topic. If you asked me to describe 6 weeks in the war in the Gulf, I just like, well, it's going to be a little tougher, but this is my universe.
And it's a really, really useful glimpse inside that universe, because I think I joked in one of my emails to you that as a person who has trained as a historian who is now a librarian, approaching the crypto world, I sort of feel like a caveman trying to understand neuroscience or something.
Mm-hmm.
So, but this has been the book really does give you an extremely compact and comprehensive and accessible introduction to that world, so something that I'm curious about, when I was explaining, medieval history as a teacher,
Mm-hmm.
I often found it was easier to teach things I didn't know as deeply than the things I knew super deeply, because I didn't know what does a beginner need to know, because I've known what an expert knows for so long.
Totally.
So as you as an expert on crypto, how do you how do you take what you know with all your accumulated expertise and render it accessible to somebody who's totally new to something like that?
Well, Jen, I don't know that I've done it successfully. I mean, I'm glad you liked it, but
Yeah.
I totally hear what you're saying, and this is a problem I've often had. I've written things before that I'm just like, I think a normal person can get this, and I'll send it to my mom and be like, "Can you get this?" She's like, "I have no idea what this says," and I'm just like, "I thought it was easy. This is, this felt very easy." So I don't know. We'll see what people think. I mean, I think I'm good at writing explainers. That's a thing that I've had a certain amount of success on out in the world, but it doesn't necessarily mean my most famous explainer ever, famous, quote unquote, but the most widely read. I mean, really crazy numbers of people have read it. It was nuts. I wrote this description of this thing when I was at CoinDesk about this concept called yield farming, which we don't need to go into what it is, but it's a weird thing. And it was 4,000 words long. My editors were like, "What the heck are you doing?" And I was like, "No, trust me, we need to print this whole thing." Actually, it's 4,500 words long. It was so long, which is very long for CoinDesk. That's nuts. And that thing has been read by a number of people that's equivalent to a large metropolitan area. It's really, and it's keeps getting read. I'm not there anymore, but I still look on Twitter every now and then, and people are still refining it and stuff like that. But those are probably people who are not complete noobs, those are probably people who've developed a certain amount of sophistication, because this is a fairly sophisticated concept. And it's okay, I get the grassroots here and I want to start going to the advanced level. And then so it could be that maybe I'm good for writing for people who are moving from intermediate to advanced, but that doesn't necessarily, who knows if I'm good at writing for people who are totally new. I don't know. It's an ongoing trouble. We'll see what people think. But so I'd be curious, one thing do you remember how I described how Bitcoin works in it? The way I explained how Bitcoin worked in the book, I took kind of a risk. I think I'm right, but what I wrote was, it doesn't matter. That was an explanation.
Yeah.
I was like, it doesn't matter. One day maybe you'll use it and then you won't care, or you'll never use it because it never catches on, and so you also won't care. But it's much like how the phone system or email works. You probably don't know how those things work either, really, but you use them, So I don't explain how Bitcoin works in the book. I give people permission to not care about it. But so that's an example of it, of me trying to, because I do think that's right for the average person, is you don't really need to know, no one really knows how money works. I mean, it's that's a hotly debated topic to this day, and we use it.
That's so true. And yeah, I'm really glad that you reminded me of that, because when you do try to get into the weeds of understanding it, it becomes very easy to quickly lose sight of what the actual story is, about the rise and fall of this particular kind of actor in this kind of space, So one thing that I'm hoping that you could talk about a little bit as we get into SBF himself, I read somewhere, I think that you wrote that people had kind of clocked him as a pirate before even the rise of FTX. And I'm wondering, why then, why did he succeed anyway for the time that he did, And does it have something to do with the nature of decentralized finance itself or cryptocurrency? Is it have a particular weakness for this kind of activity?
Mm-hmm. So that what I meant by people had clocked him by as a pirate, which is true, is like he was a complicated figure, and it was only people kind of deep in the world of crypto who saw him that way, and not even everyone saw him that way. But what that meant was he was very known for going out and doing whatever would make him the most money, and just like completely kind of steamrolling over things with his giant piles that he already had, with very little regard for whether or not it was good for like the broader crypto world. And it's a complicated thing because no one's going to pretend that everyone in crypto isn't trying to make money. They all are, right? Like they all are for sure trying to make money, but there's sort of like the beginnings of sort of norms about what is or isn't fair play. So like a good example of what he would do and what Alameda Research would do that rub people the wrong way, but they couldn't exactly say it was like illegal or wrong, but it was just like, it really was screwing things up, is like the yield farming thing I mentioned earlier. Not to go into too much detail on it, but it was this thing where people were trying to create these incentives such that lots of people would want to get involved, and they were kind of giving away free money to people. They would spin up these new monies out of nowhere, but they would have value, right? And they would say this new magic space money we just made up, if you do a certain kind of thing, which was basically always putting a certain amount of your own funds at risk somewhere, but not at very much risk, but at some risk. Like if you throw some money in here, we'll give you some of this new magic space money, and probably also some return for deploying that capital too in its own terms. And so, but what folks were trying to do in doing that was to sort of get new users. They were trying to get people to incentivize them to try it out and be like, oh, this seems like a good idea, because you're more likely to like get these things if you play around with them a little bit. So if you threw a little bit of your money in it, and the idea was it didn't even have to be much, and you could just throw a little bit in and kind of see how it worked. Be like, oh, that's a good idea. You put more in. And the way the free magic space money always worked was it was just be like pro rata. So it was just like, there'll be this much that comes out every day, and we'll just split it up equally among everybody else who's thrown some money in. Well, Sam and his crew would come along and be like, well, here's $1 billion in there. Bam, we'll take all that magic space money, and then everybody else would just be getting the dust of whatever was left over, and they would do that kind of thing again and again because they just had so much money to play with. And then they would just take all the new funds they got, and they would mostly just dump it. They would just throw it away and sell it so they could make money off of it, right? And that just completely screwed up the ability of these new entrepreneurs to actually generate new bases of users. And so it was this thing where like they were trying to take advantage of the idea of people making money. They wanted them to like want to do that, but also come in and be a part of these new concepts, these new structures. But but folks like Sam would just wreck it by throwing so much money in there and taking it all,
Mm-hmm.
And so folks knew that, and but then sometimes he would do good things. Like, I tell this whole story in there about the sushi swap story, where he kind of saved that whole thing. And he had been piratical in that beforehand, but then he did save everyone. He would launch things that people kind of thought were good at times, like on Solana, this other blockchain, he launched a bunch of products there that people liked. So he was a mixed bag. And people also kind of liked the fact that he seemed to get on well with, legislator types and DC types, and people had ambivalence about that. Just like, well, maybe this guy will actually be kind of like our hero in DC and whatever. So they were, it's just, there was a lot of ambivalence about him.
Mm-hmm.
But he was always out for his own end. And what was interesting even there is his own end, it was complicated to be against that too, because his own end wasn't like he wanted to be like Tony Stark. He wasn't like trying to pile up this giant amount of money just so he could like build skyscrapers. He had this idea of he wanted to save the world. And I believe it's true that he did want to, but I also sort of raised the question in the book, like, do we want one dude saving the world? Like, does that really maybe a worse outcome than, it sounds good. It works great in comic books, but I don't know if it works really great in the real world. And the more I pay attention to Sam, the more skeptical I am of that notion. It's just like, I don't know. It was because it was very much driven by his ego. Sam very much believed he knew better than everyone else about almost everything, and he was a really smart guy, but no one's that smart.
Yeah. I mean, that is sort of like a different facet of Tony Stark, right? Like it's like
true. I mean, Tony Stark kind of wanted to save the world too, but he had a lot of parties as well.
That's true. He had a lot more fun doing it. But like that is super interesting to me. Yeah, because like he has been painted in the media as you know, a villain, and even like I think a super villain sometimes, like to a sort of like I don't know, disturbing degree sometimes, you know, where you're worried about like the journalistic voice. But like he was very how do I say this? Like he wasn't like completely oblivious or unself-conscious about the way that he presented. You know, he did sort of like manipulate his image, I think, in some ways, you know, like he did try to control the story. And I think that was something that you mentioned in an Axios piece, right? That like I think you suggested that like the coverage of him in the wake of all this may have actually been like kind of serving his purposes, like in the wake of all this, you know? So do you think that like, did he just like lose control of the narrative at some point and like now he's trying to get it back? Or like, how do you see like the stuff that's happened since, I guess, you know?
Well, I do think a part of what, so, and I talk about this in the book too, but in fact, in the very intro too, I sort of mentioned it, but there was this period where he was just kind of everywhere right after the arrest. And I do think a piece of that, I believe, speaks to Sam's deeper character, where it wasn't just strategic. There's also this thing where I do think Sam was kind of addicted to fame. Like, I think he was really into it. Like, he really liked it. And I do think a part of the reason why he wouldn't shut up in November and early December was because he thought this might be his last taste of it. And he was going to savor as much as he could have. I mean, I don't know. I can't prove that, but that's how part of it reads to me. It was so crazy what he did with how much he spoke there. But yeah, I mean, Sam and his narrative is a complicated story. I don't really know what he was thinking. I just am convinced that he was a guy who it was very important to him, not just to do the right thing in the world, but for folks to know that it was him who did it. I do think that is right.
That's a very interesting point too. Yeah. I am glad that you brought up sort of the addiction to fame because that is absolutely, I think, at play. And, you know, how much do you think that is sort of like a particular weakness of people in this space because like they're all super online, you know, like and they're used to doing stuff for clout, you know, in addition to whatever kind of other motivations they may have?
Yeah. Yeah. It is definitely a thing, the online thing, though, a lot of people in this space, interestingly enough, are pseudonymous, which I suppose could also be satisfying. And there's some very famous people who no one knows what their name is, like they're still very famous. Well, not no one, like I think a lot of people know, but I don't know, you don't know, like the average person doesn't know. So there are a lot of people like that. There are a decent number of people in this world who are pretty influential and pretty powerful and don't say much. But Sam was not one of them. And I say this in the book. I mean, I remember this. And people might say that I'm making this up to, make myself look smarter in retrospect. I can't prove it. But I started getting very anxious about Sam and SBF when they announced, and this is like one of the things I say pretty early on, when they announced their sponsorship of the Miami Heat. I was just like, what are you doing? Like that, it was like the first, I was just like, no, this is not a good sign, and one source in particular, actually two sources I had in the book, one named and one unnamed, both kind of confirmed to me that moment did feel like something of a turn. Like that deal is interesting because I do think it was a really amazing deal. I can't remember the number right now. I say it in the book, but it's like, it was only like $9 million a year for like, it sounded like a large number when you first heard it, but it only had, it was annually for like 19 years. And like $9 million a year is just not that much money to a company like FTX when it was doing well. And like, if you watch, I don't watch much basketball, but I've seen some clips of Miami Heat games and their name was just like all over. It's just like this, that does seem like a really good deal. But I don't know, it was like they didn't have any real particular reason to need to be advertising in the United States at that point. And then they started doing lots more deals like that. And you would see Sam on social media with Tom Brady just looking so giddily happy about sitting next to him. And it was just like, this does feel like it has something to do with like Sam's ego, and like that's dangerous.
Yeah, because I guess that can become its own engine after a while and sort of replace whatever, like the actual product of what you're doing is. It's such a gosh, like it's such a complicated story, but also such a like a really necessary one, I think, in order to understand like where things are going. And I know that's a
Mhm.
huge question, but I would love for you to maybe, get a little bit into for our listeners, like what do you think the long-term fallout of this, kind of catastrophic rise and fall? Like, what do you see sort of, how do you see this affecting like, yeah, decentralized finance and like the way, I guess, really the way, I guess, in which, I'm also wondering about like how government, will end up interacting with these spaces too,
Mhm.
because it's interesting to me that you said that people thought that, he'd be really good for, he'd be a good voice in DC. And that seems to
Mhm.
be a tension like with the whole idea of the thing, right? Because it's decentralized so that you don't have that kind of oversight. So like like what happens with that tension, that like between wanting some sort of regulation but not. I don't really think I voiced that cogently, but
But I think I know what you're getting at. It's a confusing thing. So I have a million. I could talk about this topic at enormous length and be super confusing as I did so. But yeah, I mean, I think to sort of try to summarize where I think you're going in the short term is, Bitcoin and its progeny are this very rebellious thing, and yet the people who are into it want it to grow and prosper, and they want to be able to pay rent and pay their mortgages and have a happy life off of it. And to do that, it's very hard to do that in the near term if it's completely legalized. And so they basically want governments of the world to permit this thing which wants to completely undermine governments. I mean, that's what it was like created to do, right? So there's always that tension. And so it seems weird. A story you'll hear about crypto people all the time, which is just completely false, is that like they never wanted rules and they were always just like damn the torpedoes. That is like such a lie. I've been covering the space since 2017. They've always wanted, I mean, it's just again, and I've gotten so bored of hearing people talk about how like we just need rules of the road. It's just like, shut up, you guys, I've heard it. But like they do. It's just, but there is this tension there, right? And they are going to resist certain kinds of rules. It's just like, what's the point of even doing it if like, certain things become illegal? So there is that tension. So in terms of like what I think will happen, so it's this weird thing. It's just like we want rules, but at the same time we're this rebellious thing, and whatever. So what I think will what do I think will happen, and what do I think the upshot is? Well, I think it was already pretty clear that the Democrats were. I would never predicted this, but when I started this years ago, but like crypto has become a partisan issue, and the Democrats are against it and the Republicans are for it, which is like so weird to me, just zooming out somewhat, just because I guess being the age I am, I always thought the Democrats is kind of like the younger, cooler, into interesting things party, and the Republicans kind of the sticks in the mud, and just like, this is, I don't know, this doesn't feel like that, it's just like, this is not what I would have guessed 8 years ago. But that's the way the world is looking right now. So whatever, go those two sides. And Democrats seem to be kind of on the ascendant lately on a lot of levels, and they're hostile. And Sam gave them a lot of fuel for the fire. So I think the political situation for crypto in the United States looks pretty bad. But I also think the genie is well out of the bottle, and too many people use it around the world now, and that just keeps growing, and people are using it for more real things all the time. And too many really smart people are excited by the technology, and once that happens, it's over. Like that technology is going to go somewhere. So I think it's going to go somewhere largely outside of the United States for a while, but it's not going away. Like anyone who's just like, oh, this thing's gonna all blow up in like 10 minutes is like, nah, bro, it's not. I mean, I could be wrong, but I don't think so. Not the bet that I would make. So if you want my really spicy take on all this, and I'm not the only person who thinks this, people say that this last big explosion was like our dot-com bubble or our Lehman moment. I don't think that's right. I think there's one more really insane run coming, like something really nuts. Like, you think this was disruptive? No, you've seen nothing yet. Something really nuts is going to happen, then that will explode, and people will really be like, holy crap. But once again, it'll do the thing it always does, where it does a giant run up, something horrible happens, it explodes, the market falls a ton, but it doesn't fall below the prior high, which is what always happens, right? Like, so right now we're sitting around between $20,000 and $30,000. Well, what was the high of Bitcoin at the last irrational exuberant boom? The high was just below $20,000. So now the bottom is above the prior irrational exuberant boom, you know? So what'll happen next time probably is, you know, the last all-time high, the irrational exuberance was like $69,000. So probably the market will, in a few years, it'll probably be a while, the market will run up, something will happen, some new thing will come into the world that people get very excited by, and the market will explode. Bitcoin will go up super, super high, other things will go up with it. Then that'll all fall apart because something happened. It'll drop down around $69,000 for a while, and then it'll become boring. Like it will fall into the normal world. It will be the thing I said in my book where it's like, you don't need to know what Bitcoin is because you just use it, or you know, and it'll just be in the background somewhere, and it'll probably, you know, plod up at some boring, you know, S&P 500 sort of pattern from then on. But the excitement will be over, the thrill will be gone. But yeah, I think there's one more wild ride left in this disruptive change that's going in our world right now.
Wow.
That's my theory. I could be wrong.
Well, thank you for sharing the spicy take. I really am glad that you shared it with us, and that you shared this book with us. It's so fascinating. And, you know, like I just really appreciated being introduced to this situation in a way that like made it make sense to me. And that like makes me feel like I can understand now, like when things continue, I'll have like the sort of grounding to understand like as things progress from here. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I mean, if I could say one last thought on it really quickly, I think if your folks are deciding whether or not they should get the book or whatever, I think it's useful for people. Here's my argument for it. It's a story that you care about, that you're interested in, you heard about this wild thing. You get to go back through that whole story, including parts of it that you definitely have not dealt with before, but it is all within a narrative. But throughout that narrative, it provides, I think, some pretty good grounding in some of the actual mechanics of how some of these things work. I mean, I know I said I don't explain how Bitcoin works, but I do explain a number of things in it that I think will sit someone in a good cognitive place the next time this space gets interesting again, as I think it will. So I think it's a series of explainers wrapped in, I hope, an engaging narrative. And that's why I think it might be useful for people. Who knows? Yes.
And you know what, like to bring us back to like almost the very first page, like I did notice that this book is dedicated to Michael Lewis. And I think it's, you know, that's a great summary of what he does too. And I think also, I don't want to, you know, make too big a claim, but I think something that this book does, like his books, is that like you understand the situation a little bit better and like how people operate, you know, especially like vulnerable, weak, flawed people, you know?
Yeah.
So, yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming to this show. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
All right, listeners. So please pick up SBF, How the FTX Bankruptcy Unwound Crypto's Very Bad Good Guy. This has been Jen with Turn the Page, and it is time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.